As I mentioned earlier in the day, oftentimes offsets and GHG emissions are talked about synonymously, but they are very different things. Greenhouse gas emissions reductions are the actions that we should be taking to mitigate climate change. As Dr. Watson said, these are the things that we should be focusing on. Offsets is one tool to help implement greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And like any tool, if misused, could not lead to good outcomes. And so in order to use that tool of offsets appropriately, we have to consider the appropriate steps to make sure that we have a quality product, to make sure that the offsets are doing what they are intended to do. And so what we've developed in this tool is the basics on the steps to run through. So if you have an idea of any greenhouse gas reduction project that you can conceive of, and you understand the concepts on this tool, you can run through the tool yourself and basically assess whether or not, or the key here, is assess whether or not offsets are the right tool for your idea to mitigate or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You can read the primary purpose in detail. I basically explained that. But a big note here is that it's rare for the right conditions to be met for offsets to be the right tool. Greenhouse gas emissions reductions can happen in numerous ways, and offsets is just one type of tool. And so what we thought we would do is we heard from these great greenhouse gas emissions reduction projects that are happening here in the state of Hawaii. And all of these emissions reduction projects are real. They're all happening. With our first criteria on our gate key, we could pass right away with all of them, though we're going to go through all of the points on that one just because. And whether or not each one of those projects passes all the gates is not a reflection on whether or not that emissions reduction project is valuable, simply a reflection on whether they should continue to look at, or even look at in the first place, offsets to help them implement those reductions. So basically we're gonna run through this. Steve and I are gonna talk about this, and so we're gonna start with the project that DOFA presented on forestry sequestration. And with that, we'll start on quality criteria. So the first step in the quality criteria is whether or not it's real. Based on the description that they provided, based on the measurements that they've taken in the studies they've conducted, it definitely seems like it is real. There's carbon being sequestered. There's no question that that's true. And the quantifiable portion of this is demonstrated through the study that was able to also demonstrate whether or not this is real. So I'll kind of ask Steve if he has anything to say on those two, and then also get his input on the permanence of this project.
Sure. So I think I will also just quickly comment that this is a great piece of work here. I wish I had this in so many of my meetings over the years. But it is something that, is helpful in the initial stages. It shouldn't be considered something that replaces like a full feasibility, but these gates are kind of the fundamental key check boxes, so to speak, when looking at a project. And so, yeah, in respects to, I don't disagree with you in that these projects, first of all, they were all fantastic examples. In the forestry project, certainly demonstrates that it is a real project. On the quantifiable side of things, a lot of that comes down to which protocol is going to be applied. And being able to, as a reforestation project, you're forecasting the sequestration. So there's what's sometimes called ex ante accounting, but you're basically having to demonstrate based off of also the baseline that you would be establishing with the protocol. So all of those seem to be obviously being looked at, and I think from a permanence perspective, and this was brought up a few times earlier today, permanence is very different when you're looking at a land use-based project, forestry, because you are having to more or less develop that project it depends on the standard, but in perpetuity. So different standards have different permanent requirements, ranging from 40 years to 100 years. So that's something that needs to be factored into.
Yeah, and also within permanence, within many of the standards, there's also assurances with land use changes where there's a certain amount that needs to be set aside in a forestry project just in case there is a loss. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's oftentimes looked at in terms of a buffer account or a portion of credit set aside for various reversals. And those accounts look towards insuring against forest fires or other natural disasters. And then obviously if you develop a project and then you go and harvest it and you go below that baseline value, then you are having to repay those credits or figure out an alternative.
Right. So, so I think we think that there's certainly a driver that would allow for permanence with this project. And so I think that while there might be some things to think about within there, certainly I think it gets past that step. And then getting into enforceability and verification. So enforceability would then need to be achieved through putting it into a specific standard or program. And as they mentioned, they put out to bid and they're going to be working with a specific standard. So just that alone, I think, brings the enforceability component there. And then as far as whether it's verifiable, the verifiers would then come on site and then double check these other quality criteria. And so I think that, based on the description that was given, that basically this would meet this quality criteria. Any thoughts on additional thoughts on quality?
No, I think yeah, that's a
Okay.
good read. And there's also, I think, a number of reforestation protocols out there. So being able to evaluate those or adopt some of those into a specific program certainly doesn't impact eligibility.
Yeah. Okay. So
again, just to kind of bring it back about how we're going to do this exercise. So we're calling this an offset gate key, and each one of these numbered items here on the outside, we're calling a gate. So what we're going to do is kind of run through the criteria. We'll be a little slow as we go through the first time, and then we'll kind of pick up speed as we kind of get through the concept. So we'll use the 3 Hawaii-based projects that you guys heard about. They provided to us the information that we needed to do the analysis. So that's why we're thanking them so profusely for letting us use their projects to help convey this information and run through these examples. So we've run through number 1, we've gone through all the quality criteria and we've checked everything off the list. The DOFOT project example meets all those criteria, so we can move on to gate 2. So you guys can spin your wheel and we'll go on to additional.
yeah. So one thing to note too as we go here is that this gate is also designed going from the most objective portion of the gates to the most subjective portion. Some folks might question whether or not financial viability is subjective because there's hard numbers associated with it, but the amount that you're willing to accept as a return or not is definitely a subjective decision to make. And so as we go through, I think we'll talk to the fact that these do become more and more subjective. So the first gate is very much more of an objective one. Additionality is also fairly objective, but there's some subjective components to it. So with the forestry project and additionality, what we're wanting to ask is, would this project have happened if not for the conversion of the GHG emissions reduction into an offset credit? We have two tests that we run for that, and the first is the legal requirement. And so, as far as I know, there is no law in the state of Hawaii requiring this project to be forested. And so if that is indeed the case, then it would pass the legal requirement. Any additional thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, it really is, yeah, it just comes down to if there's, any type of existing easements or law that is looking to, protect that land. So
Right.
that's where it gets questionable.
Yeah. Okay, so I think they would pass the legal requirement, and the next is the performance requirement. And this is really a matter of, whether the performance requirement is specific often to the protocols, but the big question is, on a performance basis, would this project be additional to what would already exist? Would this project inadvertently increase emissions elsewhere, for example, would be part of this question. And on the face of it, I don't see the performance test being a major holdup, but certainly within any verification process, there would be a fair amount of scrutiny that went into this question. And Steve, any additional thoughts or as far as the project?
Yeah, I just would, kind of echo what you said. I mean, on the surface, I'm not a verifier, but verifiers do scrutinize additionality quite a bit. But on the surface, I don't see any, red flags. The other thing that will be not necessarily with this project, but factored into the performance additionality is just on the, the financing or what's been already committed to doing the project and at what stage that budgeting is in work.
Right.
But again, there's some, that's up to interpretation and also which standard you'd be developing it to.
Right, so I think with that performance test, what you're basically alluding to, and this is a little bit of a catch-22, we invited projects that are very much underway, and if they're already underway, there could be a question of, well, if you're doing it anyways, is the offset credit generation actually making it additional, or are you going to do it anyways? And the standards are set up in some way to address that, and the verifiers may scrutinize that element. But I think, as far as what we do know about it, this is something that I think the standards would be able to get through, and it would just be something to be aware of going forward. So.
Great. All right. So we passed through gate 2, and we can move on to gate 3 and talk about financial viability.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to actually give Steve an opportunity a little bit to talk about this first portion of this where we're talking about quantity. There was a bit in his presentation he didn't get to a little bit, but I wanted to give him an opportunity to talk about sort of rough quantity generation thresholds that make a project more financially viable.
Yeah, sure. And again, this is always really project specific and also based off of, as a project owner, what your expected returns are, or if you're tied up with investors, what they're looking for, or if it's a government funded program, all those different aspects have different, return expectations, I would say. So roughly speaking, we look at, at a minimum about 30,000 tons of credits delivered to use that as a way to kind of benchmark the financial viability. You then obviously are factoring in your development costs. We talked a bit about that earlier today, and those are also, while some of them are fixed costs, others can be less carrying forward. So it really comes down to, looking at that cost per ton, but then factoring in terms of how many credits you're producing, at what market value, how you're going to, basically demonstrate that you're making a return.
Yeah, so basically, as a general rule, your GHG reduction project that you come up with, that you're interested in converting to offsets, if you can produce at least 30,000 tons annually, or potentially in totality, depending on the kind of project, this is a general threshold that's good to understand as a starting point. And so it's meant as that sort of general kind of initial look at. And what we are aware of based on the studies that were done with DOFA is that they're looking at over 90,000 tons. So they are above this general threshold, and you can kind of start to get into more of the cost. And as Steve was pointing out in some of his slides, there's a lot of pieces that go into that. But the one thing that we do know of the cost, as far as once you deal with the fixed costs and the other pieces, is that your return on investment is based off of what the price that you can receive for the credit that you generate is. And depending on the project type and what you're looking at, this is usually somewhere between $2 and $15 a ton is essentially what the general return is for the ton generated. So there are market outliers on this, but this is a good starting point, just like that 30,000, to understand whether or not you're going to get a return on investment. And so, for example, with DOFA, another thing that we know is that over the 50-year period that they're dealing with, they have a $10.5 million budget. And what that essentially equals is over $100 a ton to produce the forestry project. And so the return that the offsets are going to yield, given these parameters, is about 10% of that operating budget. There's more complexities, and Steve will talk to that in a moment here. But just as a general starting point of understanding what you're dealing with as you're interested in converting your GHG reduction action to offsets, this is what the financial aspect of that looks like. So, Steve, any additional pieces to say?
No, I mean, I think we spoke to
Yeah.
kind of the main components of what to look at.
Okay.
Yep.
And I'll speak for the layperson, because this is where, when he first said it gets subjective, I'm like, how is math subjective? And it depends on the goal. It depends on the goal of the person who's putting the project forward. So if the goal is a profit, okay, maybe those numbers don't make sense. But if the goal is a portion, if the goal is 10% of the cost, if the goal is 20% or 100% or 150%, that's where the subjectivity comes in, is that it's for the project to choose. Does it make sense for me? And if the answer is yes, then you go on to gate 4. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, when thinking about that, you have to think about what the value of the offset is. Why is it important to you to commoditize and trade your emissions reduction? If that's an important element to you, to be able to commoditize and trade the reduction, then maybe you're willing to do it at, 5, 10, 50% of your operating costs. It's one of those things where, as we mentioned, it's the greenhouse gas emissions reduction itself that's the important element. The fact that it costs this much is not the thing to be concerned about, except for if you're planning on making up that cost through selling it as an offset. So that's something to be aware of. And so with the numbers that we do have, this is what we do know about DOFA's project. And so I know that they have run their numbers in more detail. And so, as they move forward in their process, as long as they're comfortable with the amount of return they're receiving from their offset, I think, there's no showstopper, but it's just something to be aware of. And, the other thing is they were highlighting their co-benefits of their project. And, this becomes part of the marketing piece. Can they receive a higher dollar value for their offsets because they can market them as such. And that's something really for the market to decide.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I was going to jump in because that's, as I was sitting here thinking about.
Sure.
Yeah, spoke to exactly what I was going to mention, which clearly there's co-benefits to this project. And that is a good thing, obviously. But seeing that this is a voluntary, what appears to be a voluntary approach, there's required marketing of that project. So what we oftentimes look at if we're in the voluntary space and developing projects, it's, evaluating that financial viability and then trying to find an anchor buyer early on that can support even some of those development costs, and also, upsell the co-benefit side of the project. So I just would, emphasize that in your consideration too.
Yeah. So that's kind of what DOFA's looks like for financial viability. And so I think, again, with those considerations and understanding, moving on, basically saying, no showstopper, but things to consider, moving into environmental justice.
Yeah. So we've heard Kehau speak so eloquently to this, and as I mentioned, this isn't something that you would be seeing on a standard, but it is something, especially in Hawaii, that we think is important enough to talk about, that we added it to our decision criteria as something to consider. And so do you want to run through the...
Yeah, so what we did is we wanted to distill this, and we actually saw this before seeing Dr. Watson's People's Lens, but we wanted to distill sort of the essence of what environmental justice is into some questions. And with this is really a consideration that's very subjective. Do you care about these things? If no, you don't even have to go through this gate, but it's on here in equal measure to the other ones because we think it's important. So the questions that we have as far as environmental justice, according to the project, is, has climate change been considered as a global issue where the solutions required are interconnected, an interconnected approach between global communities? So part of what's kind of baked in this question is when you take your GHG reduction and you turn it into an offset, you've now basically commoditized that emissions reduction. And if you sell it, you are no longer in ownership of the greenhouse gas reduction that you have created. You've now given that away and sold it for some value. This is an okay thing. It just needs to be understood that this is no longer on your accounting books as a reduction. It's on the accounting books of the purchaser. So that's part of what's baked into that question. The next question is, will the GHG reduction project adversely affect Indigenous peoples or local communities in its developed in? And so this is something, as Dr. Watson talked about, that's really important. And I think with all of the projects, we're not here to answer whether or not they've thought about these considerations. We would only want to say that these things should be considered. And so I'm going to read the final question, but I also want to make and emphasize that we don't actually know whether these were considered, but we would assume good faith that the reduction projects do consider these things. And so the last one here, though, is, will the GHG reduction project adversely affect developing communities or Indigenous peoples around the world through shifts in supply and demand of resources? And so with this one, a little bit different than the others, in some ways a combination of the other two. Are you shifting demand or supply of resources that adversely affect places that aren't nearly as wealthy as the location that you are a community member of? And so those are the considerations we think that every project should go through before converting to an offset credit. And I'll kind of ask over to Steve if he has any other thoughts on this one. Like I said, I think that we would presume good faith in all the projects I presented, that these were considered, but we do want to highlight it and put it forward.
Yeah, no, I have no other comments on that. And it's an important, well, I will say this, it's an important, just to echo what you were saying, certainly an important set of criteria to look at. But when it comes to actually getting a project approved and verified, similarly to the financial component, these are not, required, but certainly important to factor into creating a good project.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Watson had provided some helpful suggestions in terms of how to approach this and how to make these considerations in terms of having thoughtful, genuine communication with stakeholders, with local peoples, with indigenous peoples, and having early contact and dialogue. I think that goes a long way in terms of understanding what these impacts are and getting involvement at the early and planning stages. And one of the things that has come up through the courses of our discussion is land rights and access rights. And so there have been concerns expressed about if you have an offset project, do you fence off your land? Do you cordon off the space that you're growing your trees and restrict access for traditional uses, for cultural access? And the answer doesn't have to be no. And so that could be a way that you could address some of these issues that doesn't affect the financial piece of this, the actual criteria level things, but it is something that you could do to gain support, to honor the traditions and cultures of your local communities and indigenous peoples, and that is to hear feedback about, do you need access? What areas are important? The western side of the island, or providing use and access. And if the project developer can use that knowledge in the planning process to decide, okay, we're going to grow the trees, we're going to measure the trees, we're going to move forward, but we're also going to provide access.
Yeah, so I think, if access is part of the concern, right, with the forestry project, Steve, I think, was talking about yesterday some various components that, access doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to have carbon sequestered in the forest.
Yeah, there doesn't need to be a restriction on access. It just would factor into, potential reversals that could come about, forest fires, more activity, from visitors could increase that risk. But, overall, there's no legal restrictions around that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and I wasn't raising a concern as it related to the DOFA project specifically, just kind of in terms of a general concern that has been raised about how environmental justice fits in with the context of carbon offsets and how that consultation would go.
Yeah, I think most forest carbon projects are done on private land or native land, so where there's laws in place. But there's certainly projects that can be done on public kind of setting.
Yeah, so essentially, I think that there are some considerations to be made on the DOFA project as we kind of highlighted through each one of the steps. But generally, there's not necessarily any showstoppers, and it's really kind of up to the decisions of that organization on, what the value is to them. And so basically, if you wanted, you can turn over the gate key and see in the absolute most basic sense what the development process would look like to take that GHG emissions reduction project and ultimately convert it into an offset. It's more complicated than this even, but this is at least a starting point. So once you know that you can meet these the pieces on the gate key, then you're sort of ready to go into this larger depth and complicated process. We're going to do a couple more, but we will take some questions later. Thanks. So
I promise not to use my math example, but I take back that. So So again, just to kind of, to, build our muscles to kind of think through these processes, we're gonna go ahead and do our other Hawaii-based project. So we know our primary purpose, so we're gonna go ahead and start with the quality criteria. And we're gonna look at, biogas capture next with, Aaron Kirk's Hawaii Gas Project.
Yeah, so again, all the projects that we're here today, it does look like they're all real, quantifiable. There are protocols that exist. There's a protocol under the CDM for biogas. And so I think that as far as quality is concerned for biogas project, I think that there's not really going to be an issue here.
Yeah, and I would say too, that part of what went into the decision of who to invite, we did want to choose projects that were real, right? We didn't want to choose anybody that was going to have this, massive investment and hurdle and protocol creation investment at the front end. So all three of the projects that we chose today and that spoke today do have standards that they could qualify for. So just to kind of get that backdrop.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on the?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of,
biogas?
matching it up to a protocol, which again is one of the first things you want to do. CDM does have that. CDM is also designed for projects in developing countries. So you would have to look at, and that's just based off of how the UN designs that. So you'd have to figure out, how to adopt that. And I don't know to the extent of what's been done on that already. So that's just an observation.
Yeah, and so what Steve's pointing to is that, yes, there is a protocol within the CDM, but it's, again, more for developing countries. But having that protocol be in existence can be potentially adapted to things more locally here in Hawaii. So it would definitely need to be something looked at, but I think we'll get a little bit more information on this as we move to the other gates, so.
So we're passing gate 1.
So we'll go ahead, yep.
Gate 2. We're gonna look at additionality.
Yeah, so Steve talked about biogas from numerous sources. He talked about from landfill and agriculture. One thing I can note about landfill is that there are some pretty heavy restrictions on emissions regulations from landfills. And I think that there would likely be a legal additional issue for converting and those emissions reductions into offsets. Again, it doesn't mean that those emissions reductions aren't happening. It just means that you cannot turn it into a credit and then sell it. So landfill-wise, I think there might be a legal requirement issue. But the primary one that he spoke to was the wastewater treatment plant. There are still emissions limits. I'm not sure on greenhouse gases as far as the wastewater treatment, whether they're required to capture those. Steve, you?
That I don't know.
Yeah, I don't believe so. So I think that they would, in fact, not have an issue, though it would be something to analyze and scrutinize further to make sure, there's no local authority that's saying, we have to cap this. We'll caveat the legal one and go to the performance one and essentially, talk about whether or not these emissions reductions would have happened otherwise. So as far as these emissions reduction, whether they would have happened otherwise, one of the major assumptions going into it is that we are already and will always use natural gas as a fuel source. And so as of now, I think that's a reasonable assumption, but to assume that into the future might not be the case. And so part of the reduction associated with that project was the assumption that you will use this renewable natural gas as an alternative to more traditional natural gas. And it's that assumption that potentially in the future could draw an additionality performance issue as far as, again, converting this emissions reduction into an offset. So, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it is potentially an issue that can come about, but I don't see currently something that would preclude this from passing the performance test.
Right.
But yeah, you always have to evaluate changes to laws and what could be coming down the pipe, so to speak, and the impact that that can have to your project.
So
We're gonna pass them?
I think with some caveats and something to scrutinize, we will get to financials so we can at least demonstrate and show what's within these financials. And right off the bat, at the quantity level, we talked about that penciling out at, 30,000 tons generated. And the project that they had mentioned was just over 4,000 tons generated. This is still, again, great that these reductions happen, but as far as the value that offsets can bring to implement that project, I think it's going to be a pretty rough go as getting a return on investment. So, as far as just a surface level, whether or not offsets are going to provide value to that emissions reduction project, I think with quantity alone, we can kind of say pretty confidently that offsets aren't as useful for them. I have a few more things to say, but Steve, before I do.
Yeah, I'd agree with that general kind of observation. That type of volume matching up to the costs for developing a project would, not produce a return. But again, it depends on a lot of other, internal assumptions and decisions that I'm not privy to. The other thing to just remember too with thresholds is on the buyer side is, that threshold not only is something to look at for your own evaluation of the financial performance, but a buyer tends to also have a threshold of credits that they will purchase due to just transaction costs and trying to find projects that produce, more volume just from their own kind of cost analysis. That's something we're always kind of dealing with. It's like you present these smaller projects and large buyers are, well, that's great, but by the time I go through all the legal process and due diligence and that whole flow I provided earlier today, it can be an expensive process for them to take on.
Yeah.
Considering the compliance obligations they're trying to manage as well. So it's very nuanced, but something to add in the financial review.
Yeah, so I think, as mentioned, I think that this offsets aren't the right tool to implement this particular greenhouse gas reduction projects of biogas. And Aaron, who was here, he's left. He knew that, or he didn't know that coming in, but he knew that was a possibility.
We're telling him that.
We'll tell him later. But just that knowledge of, okay, great. If anybody asks us about offsets, we can say, great, we've looked at it, and they're already moving forward with the project, which, as I kind of had mentioned about additionality, could also have posed an issue. So they're implementing this greenhouse gas emissions reduction project. And the financials that really bear that out, and a lot of it is likely due to demand of renewable natural gas and in premiums that people are willing to pay for renewable natural gas. So this will be kind of a precursor into our final discussion that Steve and I will have. But basically, people say, well, if offsets don't help implement this GHG reduction project, what will? And biogas has an example of they're doing it. They have financials that are backing this up. A lot of that has to do with demand. We do not know what's all in their books, so we would not want to purport to say everything about them. But certainly, what's the question? If the question is, if offsets don't incentivize, what will? Well, biogas is a great example of there are other things out there. And so we'll get into kind of a little bit of those other things later. But I'd say that we can kind of reset and go back to gate one, and then talk about our third project that was presented. And I'll kind of leave it to Aaron to kind of kick off the.
Yeah, so the last one we're gonna do for the exercise is the electric vehicle adoption encouragement through charging system. That was a long one. That Jimmy Yao presented from Hawaiian Electric. So we're starting back at the quality gate, number 1, and we'll run through that.
Yeah, so, transportation is an incredibly important sector to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and so the work they're doing is, I think, very impressive. But I think that what they're doing is both real and quantifiable, as you can see by the numbers that they have. It would be permanent as long as once getting combustion engines off the road, they don't come back, and there would be an enforceability. So I think we can quickly move past quality. It's also worthy of note that there is a protocol for this under VERA, or the Verified Carbon Standard. So I think quality, it would be not an issue. And so I'm not even going to kick it to Steve to comment. We'll just go straight over.
I got excited and I spun the wheel.
We'll just
Yeah,
go.
yeah,
We'll go
yeah.
straight over to additionality.
I'll
and-
just comment that electrification's the future. There you go.
So, but I will let Steve kick off about additionality on this project.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, something that needs to be looked at is legally what's already in place or is being enforced. I don't recall.
Yeah, so I think that there might be some building codes and standards
Seen that,
within Hawaii that do have some requirements for charging stations. I think that there's a lot of energy efficiency measures in Hawaii, so many that we haven't had time to review them all. And so there may be, in fact, efficiency measures that are already on the books in Hawaii that would automatically throw this out as being able to.
Yeah, and any incentive programs that are already out there that are looking to provide,
Yeah. It would be, you would want to take a look at this closely because of the number of efficiency programs, energy efficiency programs in Hawaii. I could speak to, I know that in California, we have what's called a low carbon fuel standard, and that makes it so that type of emissions reduction cannot be converted to an offset credit. Instead, the emissions reduction just happen, people fund them, these things go forward. So I would say that for the sake of continuing to use the tool, we'll say, we'll pass it through legal, but there could be a
Question mark.
And, as far as performance, I think that we can jump the
I
gun.
jumped the gun again.
Jump the gun, but that's okay.
I like the spinny, I'm sorry.
It's like a game show here. Yeah.
So as far as performance, I think that would the emissions reduction have happened otherwise? I think with adoption of EV vehicles, it's kind of a questionable thing because, what was the general incentive? Was it the charging station that you added? Was it the cost of electric vehicles going down? It's very difficult to say which aspect is making that conversion. If you kind of boxed it in and talked about one fleet specifically, I think it'd be easier to get through this performance standard. And so you would have to, in order to get by that for this kind of project, you would need several caveats.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the standard you mentioned looks at fleet specific, right? So, and I can't speak to that specifically, but I would, suggest looking at that closer to see how that's treated.
Yeah, so I think we could go over to financials and just quickly talk about it for them. They have some numbers they were able to share with us verbally. It's primarily, as he described, as a thought experiment, which kind of is a little bit what this is. We don't want to hold them hard and fast to their numbers. But I think quantity, as far as if you look at the whole amount that they're dealing with, they're well above. But as far as cost, it looks like it's costing about $200 a ton for this expenses. And so you wouldn't get the sort of return from offsets specifically. So, I think that we've kind of outlined some pretty extensive issues with that as far as converting to offsets. But again, they're doing it. It's important. Steve subtly said EV is the future. These are important actions to happen And we should talk about it at the level at which it needs to be talked about, which is, these are greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and this is an important thing. They're getting it done, and they're not doing it with offsets. So there are financial mechanisms, there are demand systems that are in place that are enabling this to go forward. So with that, I would say, offsets are at the surface and probably even in the details, not the right tool to help implement that emissions reduction measure. But any?
Yeah, no, I would agree with your assessment there. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how the tool is intended to be operated. In the same way that offsets are a very specific tool to help implement greenhouse gas reduction projects, this is a very specialized tool to assess whether that is a useful tool. It's really only useful if you understand the concepts that are on it. But once you do, essentially any greenhouse gas reduction action or project that you can conceive of, you can now, in your hands, run through, is offsets the right implementing force to get the greenhouse gas reduction project done that I want done? And if the answer is no, that's okay. You should be more encouraged about the GHG reduction itself and find those other implementing mechanisms. So I think we have time. I saw a hand. We definitely want to take questions, and we will take questions at the end. But I think before questions, I would be interested to know if anybody has a specific GHG emissions reduction project that they would like us to kind of talk through on the merits of whether or not offsets are a useful tool for that emissions reduction project.
The car one first.
Yeah.
We do have an energy efficiency portfolio standard, so even if a private company did it, it would count towards a regulatory scheme. But the question I have is that the Hawaiian Electric wants them because we have excess solar during the day. Solar is regulated. So is that because it's tied to solar, to excess solar, which meets the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standards, would that deprive it of getting greenhouse gas offset?
I think the first part of your statement, if there is a law that is requiring these things to happen, then you could not convert the emissions reduction to an offset.
And if you didn't have that law, would the fact that you're using it to balance solar, which is required?
Yeah. If you didn't have the first law and you're using, I think that as far as additionality, I would definitely want to look at the very specific protocol. So in this case, it would be Vera's protocol. I would guess that you could get around that issue as far as additionality. It's the reason that they're doing it isn't for directly the emissions reduction, but to balance the demand in the grid. I think you can make that argument. So I think that you could theoretically, if you chose to,
because the business as usual scenario is the solar activity to the RPS, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're then doing something beyond that, I don't know, that's a tough one.
Yeah, I would also then add to, with the RPS, one of the things about the EVs, and I think that this is within their study, the emissions reductions that you get for the conversion over to EV depletes over time, because you're right now looking at it it increases over time. You're looking at it, the EV, that's the energy that's used, and you're looking at it converting fossil fuel or combustion engines to EV. And then the EV right now has an emission associated with the electricity. But as the grid cleans, then the emissions associated with the vehicle change and go down. So I think that's not actually to your question, but just a separate point that's related as I'm speaking. So, yeah.
Okay, does anybody want to run a project?
Oh, not a question, it's about a project.
Okay.
Yeah.
go
Sure,
ahead.
go for it.
Mike? How y'all doing today? I have a question. We are setting up a project on the Big Island, an improved forest management project through ACR. And going through this process that we have, I work for the Nature Conservancy, and we have an internal process that we go through before the Conservancy signs off on a project. And one of the questions that came up in this checklist that I had to fill out was about leakage. And I know, there's additionality, and we were able to kind of work through that. But then this question of leakage came up, and I'm not sure, is it part of additionality, or how do you, I couldn't really define it. And I read through the ACR protocol for improved forest management, and they talked about, like, if you take a timber resource out of the market and how that affects the pricing of that timber resource, and does that incentivize other landowners to then cut their trees. And so I was trying to work through that myself, but I don't know, can you explain that concept of leakage?
Sure.
And how that would affect
Yes.
a project?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an incredibly complicated concept. And I'm going to give a go at explaining a little bit, and I'll let Steve add on to it as well. But basically the idea, and as you kind of are alluding to, is if you create this forestry project, do then you incentivize the lack of creation of another forestry project? Or do you incentivize the cutting down of another forestry project? So is there something within your project that's affecting something somewhere else? It's an incredibly complicated question to answer because you don't know everywhere in the globe. And so especially at an individual project level, you would probably sit there and say, well, gee, I don't know how this shifts global demands. And so usually when leakage is addressed, they will maybe ask that question at the local level. It is somewhat of an aspect of additionality, but usually when it's addressed in a higher level format. One of my first jobs was looking at leakage specifically, and the main thing to look at was the inclusion of every country. Because you basically needed to understand more places in the world to understand leakage. And so at the specific project level, you would probably think to yourself, well, if you did want to address it at the project level, what forest are we planting? Is there some byproduct of this forest that might have a demand somewhere else in the world? You would only be able to answer basic, simple questions. But for example, the work that I was doing, we looked at 81 countries. We looked at forestry in all of these countries. And essentially, we would sometimes knock out countries for inclusion and have assumptions within there in our economic models that basically would end up saying, well, if you don't include these countries, then you're going to basically get, when you remove deforestation here, you're going to get these areas deforested because the crop grown, that we were looking at mostly was crops, the crop grown in this area where we're stopping deforestation is also grown in this area. And you're now going to shift the demand over there. And so that's how we were looking at leakage on this massive global scale to understand how the interconnection of these offsets were related. And so again, complicated subject. That's how they deal with it at a national level, and even more complicatedly, they do the same thing at state levels. Again, project level would be very difficult to fully be confident that leakage didn't occur. Though I'll kind of pass it over to Steve to kind of add on to that.
Yeah, I would agree with what you said in terms of the macro context of leakage. For evaluating a local project, it'd be looking at the impact that has locally, based off of that type of species, and if there was clear evidence that harvesting was directly shifting elsewhere. But you're not going to be able to demonstrate, or you wouldn't be having to go down the path of looking at leakage for a project that you're developing in Hawaii as it impacts something in the Amazon basin. I think they look at that as
Protocols
Michael
and
said,
standards
yeah.
would want to look at that are actually developing them, that would be more on their responsibility side to do that.
Right.
And to the extent that they do that well or not, is somewhat, somewhat up for debate, in all honesty. So,
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
yeah, good question, yeah, definitely.
Anybody?
Can you talk a little bit about how the protocols for avoided conversion work?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question
Protocol for
was,
avoided conversion. So that essentially looks at establishing almost like an easement or protecting a portion of land that had, and this is a forestry project, so that had previously been identified for development as one of the factors. And so it really looks at kind of, one way to look at it is it puts more or less like a protective easement fence. So it's not a conservation easement, but similar to that. And as the other protocols, whether it's an IFM or which looks at allowing for sustainable forest management practice, and avoided conversion is, the forest is left intact.
Great.
And is it
Follow-up?
only used in the forestry context? Is it ever used in working land context? Or is it just for the ecosystem for those protocols?
Sorry, the question was, is it used in other land use practices?
Other than forestry?
My understanding is only for forestry, yeah.
oh, we have someone at the microphone. We have
Oh,
someone.
well, we can just repeat that.
Okay.
Could you give us an example of a project that is really successful, that meets all these criteria? Because it seems like the ones we've discussed, they have some real impediments, right? So something where they really do pencil of where it is and, just some of the particular unique characteristics that really made it succeed.
Yeah, so you had the one that details it.
Yeah, I can talk to a project that we developed in Oregon. That is actually getting a lot of profile right now, as I mentioned earlier, due to Oregon's upcoming legislation. So this was a project with the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs, which is the largest tribe in Oregon. And we developed a project on a portion of their land that is, they're an active, about 600,000 acres or so of forest land. Of that, a big portion of it is active for harvesting. So there's a mill and a timber operation. And we were able to work with the tribe to demonstrate the gate key we just walked through early on, and developed the project for the California market. So a portion of their land holdings was developed under an improved forest management protocol. And then that was sold into the regulation. And I can't give the exact dollar amount, but it was in the millions of dollars, was then redirected back to the tribe. And the tribe has used that for a number of different activities outside of their timber business. A lot of that related to economic development. They're also applying some of those funds to some renewable energy projects. So I like talking about that one because I lived and breathed it for over 3 years, but it's a great example of how carbon finance and markets can be used through offsets to not only reduce greenhouse gases, but then have that money flow go back to economic development work, and with tribes being impacted at multiple levels, there's a lot of co-benefits from that type of project.
Yeah, and I guess, so I just would want to add to, I think there's some underlying pieces to that question, and, wanting to state that, as mentioned, most greenhouse gas reduction projects do not convert to offsets. Most greenhouse gas reduction projects that are successful aren't offsets, and there's many cases that we could talk to. But that doesn't mean that offsets isn't a useful tool. There are, in fact, cases where they are useful, and it just is a rigorous process requiring the very specific, correct circumstances to work out. And so, as part of the reason that we invited Steve as a project developer to come and talk about those very specific circumstances. So, yeah.
And Dr. Fox, I'm so sorry. No, it's okay. I've been scanning the audience, and I apologize you had to wait. Please ask us your question.
Aloha. And I just wanted to thank you first. I'm having fun spinning the wheel too, but I think it's a really great tool, and I can see us using it here directly in the decision-making bodies that I'm a part of with several folks in the room. I just kind of wanted to go back to an area you folks were talking about maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago, and just ask your insight, especially in uniquely, Hawaii has a really unique statutory environment, right, where Native Hawaiians have the legal right to enter public and private lands for subsistence, cultural, religious use. That's in HRS 7-1, 1-1, and it's in our Hawaii State Constitution, that, maybe the keys have to be entered at the same time in multiple of these areas and turned together, especially if you look at, in Hawaii's unique statutory environment, linking environmental justice, but also these, critical additional legal framework areas that, developers should really be considering when they're at the project conceptualization stage. If there's any insight you can help, bring to the work that we have here that also underscores these legal frameworks that you can't get around some of these access and gatekeeping issues.
I'll just note that, if you have a law in place that then makes it, the offset project itself not become additional through the legal aspect, again, this is not a bad thing. You have a law in place to make sure the GHG reduction action actually occurs. And so earlier this morning, I gave an example of landfills throughout the country. You would have these early adopters that were incentivized by offsets, but then you, through the law of the federal government, had more greenhouse gas emissions reductions occur because now every landfill had to do it, even if they weren't incentivized to do it before. So I wanted to make the point that essentially, just because a GHG reduction project could not become an offset because of the legal the additionality requirement, does not mean that's a bad thing, and it should not inhibit lawmakers from sitting down and saying, we don't want to make this law because we can't have offsets. Again, offsets are a tool. You shouldn't be attached to the idea of this tool. You should be attached to what's the most effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that only gets to part of your question. I think the other part is more about local communities, and I'll kind of kick it to Steve to give a little bit more on that.
No, I was just, thinking of you. I would agree with what you just said about, evaluating the legal aspects and offsets is a subset of that. On the local community side, I think it's culturally very important to be factoring that into any type of program that's being developed. The environmental justice side is very important to ensure that culturally those traditions and what's important to Hawaii, is maintained. So I would certainly, encourage that. It's something that having worked with a lot of tribes in the mainland and then up in Canada, a lot of First Nations groups, and I'm not saying by any means they're all the same. But that is something that's very important whenever we're looking at projects, is ensuring that cultural heritage, as well as, protecting that land for future generations, is part of kind of the decision-making process. And so I would just say, I don't know if that answers your question entirely, but as a comment.
Yeah, and I introduced the issue of access rights. It's just that was something that I could think of as, again, layperson, as a concrete example of, of conceptual things that you can think about at the project development stage as a mitigation measure, like the things that you have to think about, the things that you have to coordinate. So it sounds like in Hawaii, land access isn't necessarily a key concern since it's constitutionally protected. But what's the other list? And I'd say that's the thing we need to do. What else do we need to think about? And I won't do a better job than Dr. Watson did in terms of what those questions are. Who's benefiting? Who's making the decision? And those are the things that we have to look at. And then also to your point, I don't think it's necessarily 1 through 4. I think you are right that for a lot of these, you're sticking the key, you're sticking the key in and you're turning all the locks at the same time. And it was just kind of sequential in the terms of, creating something that's easy to kind of work through. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it has to be in this order. It certainly, and certainly one of the things that we're advocating is that the stakeholder involvement, the consultation, the environmental justice piece is looked at early. Because if you have an issue, it doesn't matter what your quality says. It doesn't matter. If you've looked at environmental justice and you've decided, no, this doesn't pass, this is inappropriate, we don't want to move forward, then it doesn't matter what your numbers say. So I would say that's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to the design of the gate key, this is not a must go through this order kind of deal. There are interconnected pieces here. It's a bit more complicated than this. But this is a framework by which you can begin to understand. And certainly, even if there's complications, if you do run through in this order, you'll still get the same results as if you're tying the pieces together. And so this was just our way to figure out and how to communicate these things to you folks. And this is generally what we communicate to clients all the time that come and say, well, why can't we get part of that offset game? We want to get in on that money. And so we essentially usually have this in outline format, and we go down the points one at a time. We only experience time linearly, so connecting those dots becomes a little bit challenging. So this is just one stepping thing that was designed, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, one to get it all the way through. So.
Mahalo for connecting those dots
Yeah.
circularly.
Yeah.